The wagon axle groaned like something dying as it pulled onto the hard-packed road out of Iron Bend. Beatrice kept her hands tucked beneath her apron, fingers curled against her palms, where the skin had split open along the knuckles, red going dark, now dried stiff at the edges. She did not look at them. She looked at the valley floor dropping away below the last orange of the sun, burning itself out against the ridge. Silas said nothing for the first mile. He sat the way he always sat, shoulders pulled and spine curved forward, making himself smaller than a man his size had any right to be. The reins moved through his hands like he was handling something already broken. Beside his left ear, a scar ran white from his cheekbone to his jaw, puckered at the center, where it had healed wrong. The town had a name for what he was. They said it low like a word for weather, something to warn their children about. Beatrice did not say his name. She had ridden his wagon 3 times this month, and each time he had come to the edge of her land and stopped, unloaded what she needed, and left before she could thank him properly. She owed him $17 she did not have. The mule stumbled on a loose rock. Silas steadied it without looking. When they turned the bend, where the creek crossed the road, her fence came into view. The post she'd reset twice because the ground kept heaving it, the wire she'd spliced with salvaged coil. The gate hung open. She had not left it open. "Stop here," she said. He stopped. She climbed down before he could say anything, landing in the dust with both feet, and pulled her bundle after her. He did not move to help. He had not moved to help any of the 3 times before. She turned to face the road ahead, the dark shape of her barn against the last of the light. Behind her, he spoke. "A younger man wouldn't have just dropped you out here and gone." The words were flat. Not apology, not pride. Something worse, a verdict he'd already passed on himself and couldn't find his way back from. Beatrice turned around. He was still looking at the end of the road, jaw set, a muscle working slow below his ear. He had not looked at her directly since she'd hired him on the first run. She had thought at the time it was contempt. She looked at him now. The way his hands had gone still on the reins. The way his shoulders had drawn up, not against the cold, which wasn't cold yet, but like a man bracing for the answer he already knew was coming. She understood then what she was looking at. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that wouldn't have been smaller than the silence. She just let him feel her looking. He glanced over. Once, then back to the road. She picked up her bundle and walked through the gate. The latch was bent wrong when she lifted it to close behind her. Someone had forced it. Not the wind. She stood with her hand on the iron, the metal still warm from the day's heat, and looked at the barn door that should have been shut and was not. The last sound of wagon wheels faded behind her into the dark. Her fingers tightened on the iron. The split skin across her knuckles pulled open again. She felt it without looking, a thin, clean burn, like a wire drawn too tight. She went forward. The day before the wagon ride, Beatrice had been on her knees in the scrapyard. It had started at sunrise when she'd found the irrigation ditch dry, not low, not slow, but dry, the mud at the bottom already cracking into plates. She'd walked the line upstream for half a mile before she found where it had been cut off. Clean. Deliberate. A wooden board wedged into the channel mouth and packed with clay on both sides. She knew whose hands had packed it. Vance Thorne owned 3 of the 5 wells in the valley. He owned the grain depot, the postal route, and 2 of the 3 men who sat on the town board. What he didn't own, he made useless, slowly, quietly, the way rot works through a floor beam before anyone notices the give. She'd gone to the hardware man first. He wouldn't meet her eyes. Said he was out of the couplings she needed. Said he'd been out for weeks. Said it the way men say things when they've been told what to say. She'd tried the smith next. He was sorry. Deeply sorry. Had a family, he said, as if she didn't. That was when she'd gone to the scrapyard. The other women watched from the far side of the road. 2 of them she'd shared a church pew with for 6 years. They did not cross to her side. One said something to the other behind her hand, and they both looked away when Beatrice turned. She got down into the pile and started pulling. The gear she needed was under a broken wheel rim and a length of rusted chain. She worked it loose with a length of pipe, levering up the weight until the gear rolled free. Her knuckles caught the rim edge on the way out. She pressed her fist into the dirt and kept going. By afternoon, she had what she needed. Enough to rebuild the flush gate if she could get the main bracket seated right. She hauled it back to the farm in a grain sack slung over one shoulder. She was measuring the channel mouth by lantern light when she heard the wagon. It came slow. No lantern on the rig, just the sound of the wheels and the mule's feet. It stopped at the fence line. She heard a weight drop into the grass, then the wheels again moving off without stopping. She waited until the sound was gone. Then she walked to the fence. In the grass wrapped in burlap and tied with baling cord, 3 lengths of flat steel bar, clean cut. 2 axle rods, hardwood turned smooth. A block of pine already notched for pulley housing. She crouched down and touched the notching. It had been cut with care, the kind of care that takes time a man doesn't have to spare if he hasn't made the choice to spare it. She didn't cry. Her throat tightened once and she breathed through it, and it passed. She worked through the night. By the time the sun broke the ridge, she had the frame up. By mid-morning, she had the first pulley seated. Her arms shook with each mallet swing, not from weakness, but from the kind of tiredness that lives below the muscle in the joints, in the jaw, in the back of the eyes. The rig wasn't beautiful. It wasn't meant to be. It was a lever, a rope, a wheel, and a counterweight, crude physics, the kind men had used for 1,000 years to move more than they could carry. She'd learned it from her father's almanac, the pages soft and gray from handling, and she had never needed it until now. She swung the gate twice to test it. It held. She stood back, wiped her face with her sleeve, looked at the thing she'd built from wreckage and borrowed steel and a dead man's book. Down at the far end of the road, a curtain moved in the window of the Thorne property office. She'd seen it. She knew he'd seen her. She picked up the mallet and went back to work. She found it at first light. The gate was down. Not broken loose, pulled apart. The bolts had been drawn out clean, the kind of work that takes tools and time and more than one man. The pulley frame had been knocked sideways, and the counterweight smashed off its bracket. The rope, the good rope she'd spliced herself, had been cut in 2 places and left coiled in the mud like something killed. The flush gate itself was gone. They'd taken it off the channel mount and thrown it into the ditch where it lay half submerged and bent along the spine. Beatrice stood at the edge of the channel and looked at it. The sky was pale gray. Birds were starting up in the brush along the far fence. Somewhere behind her, the mule shifted in its stall and blew out through its nose a sound so ordinary it felt wrong. She had spent 11 days building that rig. She had spent the money she'd put aside for winter feed on the hardware she couldn't salvage. She had driven the final pin into the upper bracket 3 nights ago and stood back in the dark and let herself feel for one careful minute like it might work. She pressed her back teeth together until her jaw ached. On the hill above the south pasture, a wagon sat parked in the scrub oak. She could see the shape of it, the high seat, the sloped box. She knew whose it was. Silas had seen it before she had. He was sitting very still, reins across his knees, and he was not moving. She understood why. A man with his name attached to hers gave Vance exactly the story he wanted: the disgraced hauler and the widow running some scheme together, reason enough to bring in the county clerk and call the land forfeit on moral grounds. Vance had done it before. He'd done it to the Peller family 3 years back, and they'd left in February with their wagon half-packed and their oldest boy crying in the road. She understood why Silas stayed on the hill. It didn't stop the cold that moved through her when he didn't come down. She got into the channel. The water was knee-deep and moving faster than it should have been. Yesterday's rain upstream was feeding it, and without the gate seated, there was nothing slowing the head pressure. She felt the current push against her shins, felt the mud bottom shift under her boots. She had the bent gate plate in both hands, 40 pounds of iron, and she was trying to fit it back into the channel mount by feel, because the water was too cloudy to see through. The mount was cracked. She could feel it with her fingertips, a fracture running diagonal across the seating face, the kind of damage that doesn't hold iron only slows the failure. She pressed the plate in anyway, leaned her whole weight behind it. The current pushed back. Her boot slid. She caught herself on one knee, water hitting her chest, the cold of it going straight through the fabric and into the skin beneath. She got her footing again, pressed the plate harder. Upstream, something shifted in the creek bed, a log maybe or a stone ledge giving way. The current jumped. The plate torqued in her hands, wrenched sideways, and the edge of it caught her across the palm. She held on. The water was at her waist, now still rising. Above her on the hill, the wagon hadn't moved. She looked up once, not for help, just to see. His silhouette was there, unmoving, black against the gray sky. She looked back at the water. It was rising faster. The sky had been wrong all morning, too green at the edges, too still at the center. By noon, the wind dropped to nothing. By 2 o'clock, the first wall of cloud came over the northern ridge like a door being shut. Beatrice was still in the channel when the rain started. It didn't build. It arrived full weight straight down, the kind of rain that turns road to river in minutes. The creek upstream answered immediately. She felt it in her feet before she heard it, a low vibration through the mud, like something enormous shifting its weight. She had the bent plate braced with her shoulder, both palms flat against the iron, her boots sunk 4 inches into the channel bed. It wasn't holding. It was slowing. There was a difference, and she knew it. On the far ridge, lantern light moved through the dark. 6, 7 lights, men in rain slickers, picking their way along the high rock shelf above the valley. She could hear, even through the rain, the sound of Vance Thorne's voice carrying instructions she couldn't make out. They were not coming down. They were finding high ground and waiting. The water hit her chest. She locked her elbows. The last bolt on the channel mount gave way without warning. No crack, no groan, just a sudden absence of resistance, and then the plate was gone, spinning sideways into the current, and the water came through the gap all at once, like something that had been held back too long and had stopped being patient. It took her feet. She went under sideways, one hand catching the channel edge, fingers scraping stone. The cold was absolute, not painful, yet past pain, the kind of cold that skips sensation and goes straight to weight. She pulled herself toward the bank, but the current had the center of her, and the mud had nothing to grip, and her hand was sliding. A sound split the rain above her. Not thunder. A voice, one word raw, the sound a man makes when he has decided something, and there is no taking it back. Then the water changed. Something hit the channel from above, a weight on the cable she hadn't known was there, a steel hook driven into the upper gate post with a force that rang the iron like a struck bell. The cable went bar-tight across the channel mouth, and the current broke against it, divided, slowed. In the gap it made a hand came down. Not offered. Grabbed. Silas's hand closed around her forearm, the way a man grabs a rope he cannot afford to drop. And he pulled with everything he had. She felt it through her whole arm, through her shoulder, through her teeth. And she came up out of the water and over the bank edge and onto the mud, coughing, both palms on the ground. She looked up. He was on his knees, beside her chest, heaving the cable still looped once around his left forearm, where he'd used his own body as the anchor point. The skin beneath it would bruise black by morning. He was not looking at her face. He was looking at the gate, checking the hold, checking the cable tension, the way a man looks at work he's done and is not yet sure of. The gate held. Above them on the rock shelf, the lanterns had stopped moving. Vance Thorne stood at the center of them, one hand raised to shield his face from the rain, looking down at the valley floor, where his certainty had just failed to happen. Beatrice got to her feet without help. Not pride her legs needed to find out if they still worked, and they did. She stood in the rain beside Silas and looked up at the lights on the ridge. He stood up beside her, said nothing. His breathing was still hard, and his left arm hung slightly wrong at the shoulder. Below them the gate held against the water. Above them, Vance began to move. He was smiling. She could see it even at that distance, even through the rain. Her stomach dropped before she understood why. Vance came down on horseback, which meant he'd had it waiting. The horse picked its way through the mud like it knew the ground belonged to its rider. He stopped 10 feet from them. Looked at the gate. Looked at the cable still looped around Silas's forearm. Then he smiled the way a man smiles when he's already counted the money. "Hell of a show," he said. "Truly." Neither of them answered. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, held it up between 2 fingers without unfolding it. "Bought the rail contract this morning. Signed before the storm broke." He let that sit. "Every head of cattle you move, every bushel of grain, every stick of timber off this land, it goes nowhere now without my say. The depot foreman's been informed. The loading crew's been informed." He tucked the paper back. "You can keep the farm. I want you to keep the farm. I want you right here where I can watch it." Beatrice felt the cold from the water move up through her chest and settle somewhere behind her sternum. Vance turned his horse slightly enough to put Silas in his full view. "And you?" The smile stayed but changed quality the way a knife edge catches light differently when you turn it. "You hauled for her. Bought her materials. Put your name on her debt." He shook his head slowly. "Old dog dragging a dead thing home. You didn't help her. You just gave me 2 names instead of 1. He gathered his reins. "Old, scarred up, broke down. What exactly did you think you were saving?" Something went out of Silas. Not visibly, not in his face or his hands, but Beatrice was standing close enough to feel the shift, the way you feel a fire drop when a log burns through at the center. His shoulders came down. He turned slightly away from her, just his head, just his eyes toward the dark edge of the tree line where his wagon was tied, like a man locating the door. Beatrice moved. She stepped in front of him. Not to face Vance, to face Silas. She put herself in his line of sight and stood there soaking wet mud on her jaw and looked straight at him until he looked back. His eyes were the color of creek water in November. She had not let herself look at them directly before now. There was no contempt in them. There had never been contempt. There was only a man who had been told so many times what he was worth that he had finally stopped arguing. She reached into her coat. The waxed leather tube was the size of her forearm, tied at both ends with cord and sealed at the seams with candle wax she'd pressed in with her thumbnail. She'd kept it inside the lining since October through rain and cold, and the channel work, and the storm tonight, and it had stayed dry. She pulled the cord on the near end, tipped the tube, and caught what slid out, a document rolled tight, the paper thick and cream-colored with a red seal pressed into the lower left corner. The ink was government black. The letterhead read, "Central Pacific Railroad Commission Office of Territorial Grants." She held it out toward Vance. He didn't take it. His horse shifted under him. "You want to tell me what that is?" he said. Not a question. The smile was still there, but it had stopped reaching anything above his mouth. "Survey results," she said. "Geological. 17 months of them. Your rail line runs through unstable shale for 4 miles below the Creston Cut. The commission knows because I sent them the measurements in September." She turned the document so the seal faced him. "Your contract isn't suspended. It's voided. Structural non-compliance." The rain had slowed to a drip from the eaves of the barn. Vance's horse took 1 step backward, and he didn't correct it. Silas had not moved. He was reading her face the way a man reads ground. He's about to put his weight on, looking for the place it might give. She turned back to him, held the document at her side. "He didn't know about the second part," she said quietly. "Nobody did." She watched Silas put it together. The night runs. The stops at the county seat. The rolled papers she'd handed him through the wagon window and asked him to post at the territorial office told him they were water rights filings. They were not water rights filings. His mouth opened slightly, closed. You used my wagon, he said. I needed someone Vance wouldn't watch, she said. Everyone watches you to see if you'll fall. Nobody watches where you've already been. Silas stood very still in the way of a man who has stopped trusting his own next move. The rain had quit. The valley smelled of wet iron and torn earth. Behind them, the gate held against the channel, the cable still bar-tight across the mount, and the water moved through in a controlled line the way water is supposed to move. Obedient, directed, stripped of its wildness. Beatrice turned from Silas to Vance and walked forward 3 steps through the mud. She held the document out flat, both hands, the way you'd offer something to a man you wanted to look at clearly before he answered for himself. Read the 2nd page, she said. Vance did not reach for it. His horse had gone still beneath him, ears, back weight shifted, and he was sitting the way men sit when the ground has changed and they haven't caught up yet. She read it to him instead. The Central Pacific's exclusive hauling contract for the Iron Bend Territorial Corridor, granted to the operating freight carrier of record for the valley, pending commission approval of surveyed route, said carrier having already established operational proof through 17 months of continuous service. She folded it back along its crease. They needed a carrier already running the route, she said. One who knew the ground. One with a record of delivery that didn't have a single loss in the ledger. She looked at Vance steadily. Your contract bought you a line that doesn't exist anymore. His contract is the only one left. The lantern men on the ridge had come partway down during the reading. They stopped now. 2 of them turned to each other. One turned back toward the high road. Vance's jaw moved once. Nothing came out. His horse took another step back, and this time he let it. And then he was turning, and then he was riding, and the men on the ridge were already gone before he reached the tree line. No words. No final play. Just the sound of hooves on wet rock getting smaller until it was only the creak and the drip off the eaves and the mule shifting in its stall. Beatrice listened until there was nothing left to hear. Then she turned around. Silas had not moved from where she'd left him. His left arm was held slightly away from his side. The bruising from the cable had come up dark along the forearm, visible even in the low light. He was looking at the document in her hand with an expression she didn't have a word for. Not surprise, something older than surprise. The look of a man who has spent so long being the example of what goes wrong that he has genuinely forgotten he could be anything else. She walked back to him through the mud, stopped close enough that she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes. She reached out and took his right hand, not the hurt arm, the other one, and turned it palm up. His fingers were thick and scarred across the knuckles, the skin rough and ridged from years of rope and iron and weather. She knew those hands. She'd watched them manage a mule in a crosswind and set a pulley notch in the dark and grip a cable with her weight on the other end of it. She pressed the folded document into his palm and closed his fingers over it. That's yours, she said. It has been for 17 months. I just needed to finish the paperwork. He looked down at his hand. She let him look. Then, because there was something left that needed saying something, she'd been carrying since the first night he'd dropped good steel at her fence line and driven away without waiting to be thanked, she said it plainly, the way she said everything. A younger man would have left when it got bad. His eyes came up. I don't need someone to carry me home, she said. I needed the man who stayed and held the gate. The scar along his jaw moved when he swallowed. His hand closed tighter around the document. She did not look away. Neither did he. Above them, the clouds were breaking apart along the ridge, and through the gap the first stars were coming out cold and clear, and indifferent to everything that had happened below them, the way stars always are, which is the only thing about them worth trusting.